No, the group had problems long before Yoko came along, because Beatles was such a big deal. As it happens, we've all got such a lot of goodwill hanging over from being Beatles.
George Harrison never fought for the spotlight, yet he never left the hearts of music lovers. In a band where John Lennon was the voice of rebellion, Paul McCartney the sweet light, and Ringo Starr the cheerful rhythm, Harrison was the quiet depth, a soft-spoken guitarist whose sound still echoes. He was the quiet Beatle, but his silence was never faint. It was the whisper of a soul both resolute and torn, gentle and defiant. Amidst creative pressures and towering personalities, Harrison didn't fight with arguments. He fought with music. Songs like Something, Here Comes the Sun, and While My Guitar Gently Weeps weren't just personal statements. They were gentle yet unyielding acts of resistance. He didn't shout for fairness. He let the guitar speak for him. But George Harrison's journey wasn't just written in melodies. It was a quest for identity, from a poor boy in Liverpool to a man who brought Eastern philosophy into Western pop culture. From a betrayed husband to a forgiving friend. From an underestimated musician to a resilient creative icon. And throughout his life, he stumbled, rebelled, and got hurt, but never lost faith in the music that carried both soul and humanity. If we must define George Harrison, he wasn't the quiet Beatle. He was the one who listened to the voice within and had the courage to live by it. Hit subscribe to join us in tracing the journey of a boy from Liverpool who quietly changed the course of music history. And it all began in a cold little house where George first heard music. Early life. George Harrison was born in a shabby little house at 12 Arnold Grove, Liverpool, on February 25, 1943, at a time when Britain was still reeling from the aftermath of World War II. The house had no hot water, only a coal stove for heating, and the toilet was located outside in the backyard. On winter nights, the biting cold would seep through the thin blankets. George was the youngest of 4 children, growing up in poverty, often sickly and constantly battling illness. Yet amid these harsh conditions, music came to him as a silent but powerful escape. His mother, Louise, was the one who planted the first seeds of musical love in him. While pregnant, she would often tune in to Indian radio stations, filling the house with the strange, hypnotic sounds of sitar and tabla, like a spiritual lullaby for the unborn child. She had a strong singing voice and such passion for music that it could make the window panes rattle, and she was the first to notice that her son didn't just hear music. He felt it in a special way. George didn't love school. He once said he felt suffocated in a classroom without a guitar. At Dovedale Primary School and later at the Liverpool Institute, young Harrison would fill his notebooks with drawings of guitars and dream of another world. That passion ignited fully one day in 1956 when he heard Heartbreak Hotel by Elvis Presley coming from a nearby house. That was the moment everything changed, he later recalled. I knew I had to become a guitarist. With the help of a friend, George got his first guitar for £3 and 10 shillings, money his mother struggled to spare. He learned his first chords from a neighbor and soon formed a small skiffle group called The Rebels with his brother Peter. But the biggest turning point came one morning on the school bus when 14-year-old George reconnected with an old acquaintance, Paul McCartney. Paul was the first to recognize George's unique talent. He introduced the quiet boy to John Lennon, leader of the Quarrymen. George was technically too young for the group, but everything changed when he picked up a guitar and played Raunchy right there on the upper deck of the bus. Lennon fell silent, then nodded. The boy who once curled up in a freezing room had just taken his first step on the path to legend. George Harrison didn't start with stage lights. He began with the bitter cold of poverty, with dreams dismissed by others, and with a love for music nurtured in silence. But from that very place, an artist of deep emotion and unyielding spirit was born. ready to join the band that would soon change the world. Early career. George Harrison began his musical journey in silence, just like the quiet Beatle nickname the world would later give him. But behind that calm exterior was a teenage boy from Liverpool, eager to prove himself, not with words, but with every note from his guitar. After impressing John Lennon with a rendition of Raunchy on the top deck of a bus, George was accepted into the Quarrymen, becoming the youngest member of the group. He was only 15, too young to legally play in bars or sign contracts, but too talented to ignore. With a mix of natural ability, patience, and an incredible attention to detail, George quickly carved out his role. The steady hand, the one who thickened the sound and brought a subtle energy that no one else could provide. From 1960 to 1962, the band, now called the Beatles, traveled to Hamburg, Germany, to perform in nightclubs. It was the most formative experience for George. They played up to 8 hours a night, with little sleep, no money, just music, and the stench of beer and cigarettes. But it was in that grueling environment that the boys from Liverpool became real musicians. For George, it was also the first time he realized that his playing could leave an audience speechless, and the first time he got deported for being underage and working illegally. When the Beatles signed with Brian Epstein and later with EMI, George remained the least talked about member. On stage, he stood off to the side, letting the spotlight fall on Lennon and McCartney. But in the studio, his presence grew stronger, crafting sharp guitar riffs, layering harmonies like golden padding, and constantly immersing himself in the art of recording, arrangement, and sound design. It was George who suggested incorporating the sitar, a traditional Indian instrument, into the song Norwegian Wood, marking the beginning of the psychedelic era in pop music. He was also the first in the group to begin writing his own songs, though it was a struggle to get them onto albums. Tracks like Don't Bother Me, I Need You, and If I Needed Someone may not have been masterpieces, but they revealed a unique voice, melancholic, spiritual, and unlike anyone else in the band. George's early success didn't come with thunderous applause, but through quiet perseverance. In a band led by two songwriting giants like Lennon and McCartney, he still managed to find his own voice, one that was understated, deeply musical, and forged through discipline. And it was this very foundation that would fuel his powerful rise later, when the spotlight no longer shone on four, but only on him. Career success. George Harrison didn't need to shout to be heard. He only needed one song, something. And suddenly, the world fell silent. During the golden era of the Beatles, Harrison gradually stepped out from under the towering shadow of Lennon-McCartney to become a creative force with a voice of his own. Not loud or imposing, but his music quietly permeated. Through delicate guitar work and increasingly profound songs filled with spirituality and introspection. In the early years, Harrison was sidelined as a songwriter. Though he had penned Don't Bother Me on with the Beatles, 1963, the following albums were dominated by John and Paul. Still, George observed, studied, and refined. By the time Rubber Soul, 1965, and Revolver, 1966, arrived, he broke through. His song Taxman, biting and rebellious, proved he was not just a guitarist, but a sharp social commentator. Around this time, his growing fascination with Indian philosophy and instruments like the sitar positioned Harrison as a pioneer in blending Eastern elements into Western pop music, a quiet revolution with global impact. Harrison infused a spiritual and contemplative tone into Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and especially the White Album, with songs like While My Guitar Gently Weeps, for which he famously invited Eric Clapton to play, defying the Beatles' unwritten rule against outsiders. This act also revealed his growing frustration with the band's internal tensions, Lennon's increasing involvement with Yoko Ono and Paul's tightening grip in the studio. In 1969, Harrison released Something, a stunning ballad that Frank Sinatra later called the greatest love song ever written. It became not only Harrison's biggest hit during the Beatles era, but also the first time one of his compositions was selected as an A-side single, an unprecedented moment in the band's history. It marked a turning point. From a supporting role, Harrison stepped into the center of the creative spotlight. Yet at the height of this success, the Beatles were nearing their end. In 1969, George abruptly quit the band during the Let It Be sessions due to rising tensions with Lennon. Though he returned shortly after, the cracks were irreparable. When the band finally dissolved in 1970, Harrison was the only one who emerged with a vast reservoir of unreleased material, the product of years spent in the background, quietly creating. For George Harrison, success didn't come from standing center stage. It came from staying true to his path, even when everyone else walked another. In a music world driven by ego and fame, he chose silence, sincerity, and depth. And that's what made him more than just a Beatle. He became a galaxy of his own, full of quiet brilliance. Solo career. When the Beatles disbanded in 1970, many assumed George Harrison would struggle to find his footing between the towering shadows of Lennon and McCartney, but they were wrong. While John immersed himself in politics and Paul wrestled with shaping a new band, George emerged with something no one expected: a treasure trove of music built up over a decade and a deeply personal voice that had never truly been heard. Later that same year, Harrison released All Things Must Pass, his debut solo album and the first triple album in pop music history. It wasn't just an attempt to break free from the Beatles' legacy, it was the most powerful artistic statement he had ever made. With songs like My Sweet Lord, Isn't It a Pity, and Beware of Darkness, Harrison invited listeners into a world that was both mystical and contemplative, where music became a path to spiritual truth, no longer a tool for fame or self-assertion. My Sweet Lord became a global hit, making him the first Beatle to top both the UK and US charts in his solo career. But the joy was short-lived. The song was sued for allegedly plagiarizing He's So Fine by the Chiffons. Though Harrison maintained he had unconsciously borrowed the melody, the court still ruled it a copyright infringement. The lawsuit dragged on for nearly a decade, leaving a painful scar on an artist who had always strived for sincerity. Still, Harrison pressed on. In 1971, he organized the Concert for Bangladesh at Madison Square Garden, the first major benefit concert in rock history, bringing together legends like Bob Dylan, Eric Clapton, Ringo Starr, Billy Preston, and Ravi Shankar. It was not only a musical milestone, but also raised over $12 million for war victims in Bangladesh, proving that rock could do more than sell records and tickets. In the following years, Harrison released several deeply personal albums, such as Living in the Material World, 1973, 33 1/3, 1976, and George Harrison, 1979, featuring songs like Give Me Love, Give Me Peace on Earth, This Song, and Blow Away. Not all were commercial hits, but each carried George's unmistakable touch: meditative, gentle, quietly satirical, and sometimes hauntingly profound. In the 1980s, while many of his contemporaries got swept up in synth-pop trends and MTV aesthetics, George stayed true to himself and made a surprising comeback with Cloud 9, 1987. Produced by Jeff Lynne of Electric Light Orchestra, the album featured Got My Mind Set on You, which became the last Billboard #1 hit by any former Beatle. Once again, the most underestimated Beatle had risen to the top. Soon after, Harrison co-founded the supergroup Traveling Wilburys with Bob Dylan, Tom Petty, Roy Orbison, and Jeff Lynne. Under humorous pseudonyms like Nelson Wilbury and Spike Wilbury, they released 2 successful albums, with Traveling Wilburys Volume 1, 1988, hailed as one of the rare collaborative projects that was fun, high quality, and free of ego clashes. But after the 1980s, Harrison gradually withdrew from the spotlight. Not because he lacked inspiration, but because he no longer felt drawn to the machinery of fame. He spent much of his time tending to his gardens at Friar Park, his Victorian-era estate, and took part only in selective projects, such as re-recording While My Guitar Gently Weeps for the anthology series, or writing his memoir, I, Me, Mine, where he spoke more about gardening, cars, and meditation than about Beatles music. George Harrison never made music to please the masses. He wrote from something deeper, sometimes pain, sometimes gratitude, sometimes just the need to listen to himself. And because of that, his solo career, though quiet, continues to resonate long after the applause has faded. Relationships and internal conflicts. The Beatles were the greatest musical phenomenon of the 20th century, but behind the dazzling machine was a web of growing fractures, especially for George Harrison, who often felt like a guest in the very band he helped build. At 17, Harrison joined the group as the kid brother, not only in age but also in creative standing. In the early days, he admired John Lennon, whose rebellious spirit and natural leadership he looked up to. Paul McCartney, on the other hand, was methodical, ambitious, and increasingly controlling of every aspect, from songwriting and arrangements to studio techniques. Meanwhile, George, quiet and introspective, struggled to carve out a space to express himself. Throughout nearly a decade with the Beatles, Harrison managed to get only a handful of songs onto the group's albums, even though he had written many more. Songs like Isn't It a Pity, All Things Must Pass, and Let It Down were outright rejected by Lennon and McCartney, not because they were bad, but because they weren't theirs. Harrison once bitterly remarked, "I had to play dozens of Paul's songs before he'd let me bring one of mine." What hurt George most was the unspoken dismissal, as if he was just the lead guitarist, not an equal artist. McCartney frequently interfered with his playing. In the Let It Be documentary, 1970, there's a now famous scene where, after being repeatedly corrected by Paul, George finally says with quiet exhaustion, "I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all. Whatever it is that'll please you." It wasn't an angry outburst. It was a silent surrender. And that silence over the years built up into resentment. His relationship with Lennon was more complex. Harrison had once idolized John as a pathfinder, but when Yoko Ono entered the picture and began occupying more and more of Lennon's attention, George felt abandoned. He was frustrated by Yoko's constant presence in the studio, her involvement in band meetings and songwriting discussions. John not only allowed it, but grew cold toward anyone who objected, including George. By late 1969, after a heated argument with Lennon during a session at Twickenham Studios, Harrison abruptly quit the band. In his diary, he wrote simply, "Left the group, goodbye." No one chased after him. Only Ringo and Paul quietly visited George's home a few days later, speaking gently and convincing him to return. Not with promises, but with the reassurance that his voice mattered. After the band's official breakup in 1970, George exploded creatively with All Things Must Pass, a long-awaited release of all that had been suppressed. Around this time, he didn't hide his frustration with Paul, expressing it through songs like Wah Wah and Sue Me, Sue You Blues. When organizing the concert for Bangladesh, George pointedly did not invite McCartney, believing Paul still hadn't let go of his old power dynamic. Their relationship slowly thawed by the late 1990s, particularly during work on the Beatles anthology project. But the crack never fully healed. After George passed away, Paul said, "I always felt like I was George's older brother, but maybe I didn't listen enough." With John, the bond was conflicted. Despite their clashes in the Beatles' final years, George played guitar on How Do You Sleep, Lennon's biting attack on McCartney, yet their friendship gradually faded. When John was assassinated in 1980, George quietly wrote "All Those Years Ago," a deeply emotional tribute, and perhaps a late apology. In a band where everyone's ego loomed large, George Harrison was never insignificant. But he chose the path of silence. And sometimes that silence was the most powerful expression of the loneliness felt by an artist trapped between two towering geniuses. Personal life. George Harrison was not one to showcase his private life, yet it was precisely in his quiet, conflicted relationships that we see the truest portrait of the man behind the calm exterior. His love story with Pattie Boyd, the English muse and dazzling model of the 1960s, wasn't just a famous romance. It became a silent tragedy involving three people: George, Pattie, and Eric Clapton. George first met Pattie in 1964 when she appeared in A Hard Day's Night, the Beatles film. He was immediately captivated. "Will you marry me?" George asked, almost like a prophecy. They married in 1966, at the height of Beatlemania, surrounded by flashbulbs and adoring crowds. But from the beginning, their marriage was out of sync. Pattie yearned for romance, while George, introverted and increasingly consumed by meditation and music, drifted inward. By the 1970s, as George delved deeper into Hinduism and sought spiritual enlightenment, Pattie felt left behind. She once said, "I loved George, but I was no longer his priority. His path to God had replaced me." Meanwhile, Eric Clapton, George's close friend, had fallen deeply in love with Pattie and wrote Layla as a desperate plea for her love. Ironically, George knew everything and did nothing to stop it, partly because he believed in destiny and partly because he himself was no longer fully present in the marriage. At the time, George was far from an ideal husband. Rumors swirled of affairs, including one with Ringo Starr's wife, Maureen. Their home became a place of waiting, of silence, and eventually of parting. Pattie left George in 1974. The divorce was finalized in 1977. A year later, she married Eric Clapton. Yet, contrary to the tabloid image of a dramatic love triangle, George shocked the public by remaining friends with Eric. They continued making music, sharing drinks, and even joking on stage about their unusual romantic history. Soon after, George met Olivia Arias, a Mexican woman working at his record label. They married in 1978, quietly and privately. With Olivia, George was no longer a superstar, but a man trying to start over. That same year, their son, Donnie Harrison, was born. The father-son bond between George and Donnie was deep and unshakable. George once said, "I don't want my son to grow up like I did, always feeling out of place." And indeed, in George's final years, Donnie never left his side, even helping to complete his final album, Brainwashed, after his death. Even after remarrying, Pattie's presence lingered, in songs like So Sad, in the sighs George would let out when recalling those early years. But he harbored no bitterness. When asked about the strange relationship between him, Clapton, and Pattie, George once said, "We don't own anyone. Love isn't something to possess. It's something to understand." A statement that sounded like a Zen koan, yet carried the weight of scars and forgiveness. George Harrison's personal life wasn't a tale of perfect love. It had betrayal, distance, retreat, and pain. But in the end, he found something many never do. A love quiet enough to heal, a small family that needed no validation, and a belief that happiness comes not from holding on, but from letting go at the right moment. Final years and legacy. George Harrison didn't die. He simply withdrew, slowly and peacefully, like a beautiful song fading out without the need for a dramatic finale. In his final years, he lived like a recluse in a fairy tale garden, Friar Park, where trees grew wild, flowers bloomed in their own time, and music was only played when it truly mattered. After the success of the Traveling Wilburys and Cloud 9, George largely stepped out of the public eye. He distanced himself from media frenzy, avoided Hollywood, and left the spotlight behind. Instead, he devoted his time to Olivia, his son Donnie, and the simple joys of life: gardening, vintage cars, meditation, and long moments of quiet reflection. He once said, "We spend so much time earning money and too little time understanding who we are." But silence did not mean surrender. In 1997, George was diagnosed with throat cancer. He underwent aggressive treatment and seemed to recover. However, in 1999, a horrific event shook his world. A mentally unstable intruder broke into Friar Park in the middle of the night and attacked him with a knife. George was stabbed multiple times in the chest and neck and survived only thanks to the bravery of Olivia, who wrestled the assailant to the ground. Police later stated it was as much a murder attempt as the one that took John Lennon's life. The attack left deep psychological scars. George became even more reclusive, limiting contact to only a few close friends like Tom Petty and Jeff Lynne. Then the cancer returned, this time in his lungs and brain. For 2 years, George quietly battled the illness, traveling between Switzerland and the United States for treatment. He gave no press statements, no public complaints, and never disclosed his medical condition. When asked how he was doing, he simply smiled. "Everything will be fine, one way or another." On November 29, 2001, George Harrison took his final breath in Los Angeles, in the arms of Olivia and Donnie. He left behind a simple message: "Think of me and smile, not of what you feel is painful." His ashes were cremated and scattered in the Ganges River, in accordance with the Hindu rituals he had embraced throughout his life. But George did not disappear. Concert for George, a memorial concert held at the Royal Albert Hall in 2002, gathered an extraordinary lineup: Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr, Eric Clapton, Tom Petty, Billy Preston. They performed the songs George had written, not to mourn, but to smile. That night, no one cried. They sang. George Harrison's legacy doesn't lie in record sales or the number of awards won. It lies in the awareness he brought to pop music, the idea that an artist doesn't need to shout to be heard. It was his silence, his meditation, his humility that opened a new depth in popular music. He introduced Indian music to the West, working with Ravi Shankar long before the world knew what a sitar was. He used rock for humanitarian efforts, organizing the Concert for Bangladesh before Live Aid ever existed. He never called himself a leader, yet became a spiritual anchor for an entire generation of musicians. George Harrison never had to shout to make the world listen. He didn't fight for the spotlight, didn't chase trends, and never tried to prove he was a genius. And perhaps that's exactly why. He became the only Beatle who makes us fall silent when his name is mentioned. He didn't speak much, but when he did, it felt like truth. He didn't seek fame, yet left behind a timeless legacy. He didn't hide his pain, because he understood. Only truth leads to peace. From Something, the greatest love song Frank Sinatra ever praised, to While My Guitar Gently Weeps, the sigh of a soul longing to be heard. From My Sweet Lord, a yearning for the divine, to Here Comes the Sun, a quiet belief that tomorrow will be brighter. George Harrison left us not just songs, but a map for those lost in the dark. He left this world without noise, like a bird quietly leaving the flock, a star fading in the distance, but never truly gone. What do you think about George Harrison's quiet yet profound journey? Among all the songs he left behind, which one touched you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to hit like and subscribe to continue exploring the legends that live on through time.